I've always loved hiking. The isolation, the quiet, the sense of being alone in nature. It calms me. There's something peaceful about it. Just walking for hours with nothing but the sound of your own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. I'd been doing it for years, ever since I was a teenager, but this hike was different. I should have known it was a bad idea to go out there alone, but I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a quick weekend hike through the woods near my cabin. No big deal, right? I'd been to these woods dozens of times before. I knew the trails like the back of my hand. The trees were thick but not too dense. The path was clear. Even so, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in my chest as soon as I set out. It was the kind of feeling that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the kind you can't quite explain but know is there, like an itch you can't scratch. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees started to grow taller, their trunks thicker, blocking out the sunlight. The further I went, the darker it became. I checked my watch, 2 p.m., but in those woods it was already twilight. There was a strange, oppressive quiet in the air, the kind that presses on your eardrums, making the sound of your own breath seem unbearably loud. The birds had stopped singing. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my footsteps growing louder against the now damp earth. I had been walking for almost 2 hours, and the path was beginning to twist in ways that didn't quite make sense. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was just my eyes adjusting, the shadows playing games on the trees. But no, I saw it again. A light deep within the woods. It wasn't like a flash from a flashlight or a glow from a distant campfire. It was a soft, pulsing glow, like a lantern hanging from the air itself, suspended in the thick dark of the trees. It was faint, almost too faint to see, but it was unmistakable. At first, I thought it was a person, someone else hiking the trails. But as I stood still, straining my eyes to focus on the source of the light, something didn't feel right. The light was moving. It wasn't bobbing like someone walking with a lantern. It was swaying like a thing, like it was alive. My heart began to race. I shouldn't have followed it. I knew that now. But something inside me made me take a step forward. I told myself I just wanted to see what it was. It was probably nothing, just some weird natural phenomenon. I kept my eyes fixed on it as I moved forward, the glow faint but unmistakable. As I pushed through the underbrush, I realized something worse. The woods had grown silent again. No wind, no rustling leaves, just me and the glow ahead. The closer I got, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't like any light I had ever seen. It wasn't like a lantern or a flashlight beam. It was more ethereal, almost as if it were floating, suspended in midair. And as I drew closer, something in the pit of my stomach told me that I wasn't supposed to be here. When I finally reached the source, I found nothing. The light, that eerie floating glow, had vanished. And in its place was darkness, a dense, suffocating shadow that seemed to stretch out across the trees, closing in on me. The air grew heavy, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. I started to turn back, but then I heard it. A voice, software, almost a whisper, but clear enough for me to hear.
Stay.
I froze. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from anywhere near me. It came from everywhere. It came from the trees, the very ground beneath my feet. It was in the air, in my bones.
Stay with me.
A cold, creeping terror washed over me as I realized something horrible. I wasn't alone. The woods, the trees, the air, it was all alive. It had always been alive, and now it was awake. I began walking faster, my legs moving on their own. I had to get out, but no matter which direction I turned, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were no longer friendly. The air was thick, oppressive, as if it was actively trying to keep me there. The light didn't return, but I could feel something unseen, pushing me further into the woods. I started running, my breath ragged, my feet stumbling over roots and branches. But the deeper I went, the more disorienting it became. The trees were unfamiliar now. I couldn't remember which way I had come from. I was lost. Then I saw it again, the light. This time, it wasn't pulsing softly. It was staring at me. The glow seemed to fix on me, and I felt a cold rush of air sweep past me, like something huge, invisible, was moving through the trees. And then I heard it again, that whisper.
"You're never leaving."
I didn't hesitate this time. I didn't think. I just ran. I don't remember how long I ran. All I know is that when I finally broke free from the trees, I was in a completely different place. A meadow, a wide clearing that stretched out under the moonlight. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, my body shaking violently. But when I looked up, I saw something in the distance. The trees were still there, the woods looming behind me. But at the edge of the woods, standing in the dark, there was a figure, a man, but not a man. His body was twisted, contorted, his face obscured by shadow, but his eyes glowed the same soft, eerie light, and he was staring directly at me.
"You were always meant to stay."
I ran back to my cabin, terrified. I never went back into the woods. The next day, I packed my things and left Marlowe Street. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. That thing, whatever it was still in those woods. And even now, as I sit here, I can still feel the cold presence of that figure watching me, waiting. Every time I close my eyes, I can see the glow that calls me back. The woods are waiting for me to return. And one day, I know I will. It's strange how sometimes the most terrifying things don't happen at night, but during the quiet, normal moments of your life. For me, it wasn't a strange noise that woke me up or a shadow at the corner of my eye that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a room, a single, unassuming room at the end of the hall that I wasn't supposed to see. I moved into the house on Harris Street almost a year ago. It was an old Victorian-style house with creaky floors and doors that never quite closed properly. The kind of house where you could almost hear the past breathing through the walls. It had a certain charm to it, though. The kind of place you could imagine living in for a long time, curling up in front of the fireplace and forgetting about the world outside. I wasn't alone in the house. I lived with my younger sister, Mia. She was the outgoing one, the bubbly one who seemed to have no fear of the world around her. We'd been through a lot together, having moved around from place to place after our parents passed away. I guess you could say the house felt like a fresh start for us both, even if it was old and strange in places. The thing about this house was that it felt alive. You'd think I was being dramatic, but that's the only way I can describe it. The air inside felt heavy, like the house was breathing, like it had a presence that was always just behind you. At first, I thought I was just adjusting to the new space, but after a few days, I started to notice things I couldn't explain. I kept hearing footsteps in the hallways at night, but when I went to investigate, there was no one there, just the same old, dark, empty hall. The feeling of being watched, that heavy, oppressive sense of something lingering just out of sight, was constant. Every time I turned around, I felt like there was someone standing behind me, but when I looked, nothing was there. It wasn't until we found the room that things really started to spiral. One evening, Mia and I were sitting in the living room watching an old movie. I remember we were laughing at some cheesy line in the film when Mia suddenly stopped, her expression shifting from amusement to confusion. She stood up, looking toward the hallway. "Is that door always open?" she asked, pointing to the farthest door at the end of the hall. I looked. The door was slightly ajar, a narrow sliver of blackness visible through the gap. We'd never opened it, and I was sure it hadn't been opened before. It was one of those doors that didn't seem to have a lock or a doorknob, just a smooth wooden surface, its grain faded with age. I stood up to check it out, my curiosity getting the better of me. As I walked down the hall, I felt my heartbeat quicken. The house was too quiet now, too still. The air felt thick, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch longer than usual. The door was further down, right at the end of the corridor where the hallway seemed to end, and where everything felt wrong. I reached for the door. It wasn't locked, but there was something strange about the way the handle turned, as if the door were fighting me. It was like it didn't want to open. But I finally managed to get it to budge, pushing the door open just a little bit. Behind it was another hallway, one that led down. I couldn't see the end of it. It stretched far beyond the darkness, a hallway that shouldn't have been there, as if the house itself had hidden it. My stomach churned as I looked down that narrow passage. "Mia, don't come in here," I called, my voice shaky. But Mia was already there, standing beside me, peering into the unknown. "Why is this here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer, but I felt the weight of it, the danger lurking just beyond the threshold. We decided to leave it alone, but the door stayed open. The hallway beckoned, its darkness inviting us to step closer, to cross into it. It was like the house had opened its mouth, and we had seen something we weren't supposed to see. For the next few days we stayed away from it, but the feeling never left. That heavy presence, that feeling of something waiting in the dark, pressing down on us, was unbearable, and that's when the dreams started. I remember the first night it happened. I had been asleep for only a few hours when I woke up suddenly drenched in sweat. The dreams had felt too real, too vivid. I'd dreamed of that hallway, the one behind the door, only in my dream. I was walking down it. The walls were closing in on me. I felt something chasing me. There was a noise low and guttural, like the air itself was being sucked into a void. And then, at the end of the hall, I saw something standing in the darkness. A figure, tall, shadowy, with no face. It didn't speak, didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, waiting. I shot up in bed, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The next day, I could tell Mia was having the same dreams. She was pale, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She didn't need to say anything. I could feel it too. Something was wrong. Something was in the house, in that room at the end of the hall. We avoided it, for a while at least. But the house had other plans. One afternoon, I came home from work and found Mia missing. I wasn't alarmed at first. She was probably out, visiting friends or doing something, I thought. But as I wandered through the house, checking her usual spots, I started to feel a knot in my stomach. I couldn't find her anywhere. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound like nails against wood. It was coming from down the hall. My breath caught in my throat. It was unmistakable. The noise was coming from that door. I approached it cautiously, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. The door opened with the same reluctant creak it always had, revealing the narrow hallway beyond. But this time, something had changed. At the end of the hall, I could see Mia standing in the dark, her back to me, motionless. Her hair hung limp, and her shoulders were slumped, as though something weighed heavily on her. "Mia," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. She didn't move. She didn't answer. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw the shadow standing beside her, towering over her. It wasn't her reflection. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. The figure reached out, its hands grabbing Mia's shoulders, and that's when I saw it. Its face. A face made of shifting shadows, a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with too many teeth. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, frozen by the sheer terror of it. Before I could move, the darkness swallowed her whole. And then the hallway was silent. I never saw Mia again. The door at the end of the hall is always open now, and sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers. I don't dare go near it. The hallway is waiting for me. It's waiting for anyone foolish enough to look. You always hear stories about abandoned houses. There's something about them that pulls people in. Maybe it's curiosity, or maybe it's the hope of discovering something no one else has. For me, it was neither. It started as a dare. My friend Ethan was the adventurous type, always looking for the next thrill. Me, not so much. But when he found an article online about the house in the woods, he couldn't stop talking about it. "It's only a half-hour hike from the highway," he said, leaning over my couch with that wild grin of his. "People say it's haunted, like legit haunted." I rolled my eyes. Define legit. Ethan grabbed his phone and pulled up the article. It was a blurry blog post written by someone who claimed they'd found the house years ago while hiking. They said they felt drawn to it, like it was calling them. The pictures were grainy, but you could make out a sagging roof, broken windows, and thick vines swallowing the structure. "They say no one who stayed there overnight ever came back," Ethan said, his voice dropping theatrically. "Sure," I said, "and the house eats people, right?" But something about the picture stuck with me. There was a heaviness to it, like the house itself carried a secret too big to hold. Ethan wouldn't let it go. The next weekend, he showed up at my apartment with 2 flashlights, a backpack, and a cooler full of snacks. "We're doing this," he said, "and because I'm an idiot, or maybe just a sucker for his enthusiasm." I agreed. We parked the car near the edge of the woods, right where the highway curved away from the tree line. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows. Ethan was practically skipping as we started down the trail. "You're gonna thank me for this," he said, pushing branches out of his way. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the dirt path. I tried to laugh it off, but there was something about the stillness that set my teeth on edge. After about 30 minutes, we saw it. The house. It sat in a small clearing, leaning to one side like it had been abandoned for decades. The roof was caved in at one corner, and the windows gaped like hollow eyes. Ivy climbed the walls, choking what little life might have been left in the structure. Ethan let out a low whistle. "Damn, it's perfect." "Perfect for what?" I muttered, but he was already moving toward the porch. The air grew colder as we approached. Not the kind of chill you get on an autumn evening. This was different. Heavy. Wrong. The wooden porch groaned under our weight as we stepped up to the door. It was barely hanging on its hinges, splintered and warped with age. Ethan gave me a look, then pushed it open with a loud creak. Inside, the smell hit us first. It was a mix of mold, rot, and something metallic, like old blood. Dust floated in the air, catching the weak light from the broken windows. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the patterns faded and unrecognizable. "This is amazing," Ethan said, snapping pictures with his phone. I wasn't so sure. Every instinct I had was screaming to leave. But Ethan was already exploring, disappearing into one of the side rooms. "Ethan, wait!" I called, but my voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the house itself. I followed him, stepping over broken furniture and what looked like the remains of small animals. The floor creaked under my feet, threatening to give way at any moment. I found him in what must have been the living room. There was a fireplace at one end, blackened with soot. Above it hung a mirror, cracked, but intact enough to show a warped reflection of the room. Ethan was standing in front of it, staring. "Ethan!" He didn't respond. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch his shoulder, and that's when I saw it. In the mirror, there was something behind us. It was just a shadow at first, but as I stared, it began to take shape, tall, thin. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Ethan, we need to go," I whispered, but he didn't move. His eyes were wide, fixed on the mirror. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. I grabbed his arm and yanked him away. The moment I did, the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass raining to the floor. Ethan snapped out of it, blinking like he'd just woken from a nightmare. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered. "I don't know," I said, "but we're leaving. Now." We made it back to the porch when we heard it. A low, guttural sound like a growl coming from deep inside the house. I turned back, and for a split second I thought I saw something move in the shadows, something tall and skeletal crawling on all fours. Ethan froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I grabbed his arm and dragged him down the steps, through the clearing and back onto the trail. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house, the mirror, the thing in the shadows. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. "Don't look in the mirror." I called him immediately, but the line was dead. The next morning, I drove to his apartment. The door was unlocked, the place a mess, like he'd left in a hurry. In his bathroom, the mirror was shattered, the shards scattered across the sink, and scrawled on the wall in what looked like blood were the words, "It came through."